And we should be live. So I always say this right at the start. We're either live and we're talking to the masses, or we're live and we're talking to ourselves. But either way, we're recording. So if we aren't live, we'll be able to see something a little bit later when I push out the recording. But I'm working on the premise that we're live. So to help us do that, if you are watching, lovely LinkedIn audience, and just so we aren't going absolutely bonkers, please feel free to introduce yourself and make some new connections. Drop a comment into the comment section below, because that will help us recognize the fact that we're live and we're talking to a live streaming audience. But we are here for is it the 9th? I can't even remember what number we're on this year, but we are here for the performance management and coaching webinar via the Contact Center Network. And to help explore that topic this month, we've got the lovely Helen Beaumont Manahan from BPA Quality. And we've got the ever so handsome Danny Wareham from Fairgoon. Have I said that right, Danny?
It's Fairgoon, and my mum thinks I'm handsome, so that counts.
I always want to emphasize the you for some reason. But we are live, and Graham Bunting in the chat has just said hello.
Hi,
so
Graham.
I'll say hello back to you, Graham. Thank you very much. Nice to see you. And just for confirming that we are live, which is brilliant. So I'm going to let Danny and Helen introduce themselves. We'll start with ladies first, with Helen. Tell the audience a little bit about you, Helen, who you are, what your favourite colour is, and anything interesting.
So, favourite colour is green. I'm Helen Beaumont Manahan. I'm head of training and development at BPA Quality UK. And I hate it when people ask for a fun fact. So I'm full of cold. There you go. And apologies if I sound a bit sniffy today, but I'm going to try and power through and hopefully sound reasonably intelligent. Although Danny makes me look good anyway. So there we go.
I'm not sure if that's a compliment.
No, it is. I've already told you today, Danny, on LinkedIn, I'm going to be palming off any tricky questions to you because I know you can handle them.
Brilliant. Danny, let the audience know a little bit about yourself and who you are.
So my name is Danny Wareham from Fairgoon. I'm an organizational psychologist, and I specialize in culture and personality, particularly narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellism, which can sometimes be useful traits.
All of which you suffer from.
Well, an open question. Do we want
maybe one shape of
influence others? Do we want people that are able to be optimistic and, challenge some of the rules? Well, those are narcissistic and Machiavellian traits. So sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. The same as being an extrovert is sometimes good and sometimes it's bad.
Absolutely.
My favorite color is purple.
I think green. Maybe join you, Helen, for my favorite color. So thanks very much, Helen, and thanks very much, Danny, for joining. I know we have prepared a little bit for this, so we've got some really good questions that are designed, I suppose, to stimulate this topic and bring out some conversation. But as ever with the Contact Center Network, what is slightly different with it is we want your thoughts, we want your questions, and we want people who are listening, who are going through all of these different conversations on a day-to-day basis in the operation, to ask their questions. So please feel free to drop any questions that you've got on the topic of performance management and coaching, or managing people in a hybrid world, anything that you think is relevant to this topic, into the comments. And as we did with Graham earlier, and I'll just show it again, it will show up as if by magic below, and we'll be able to ask the panelists one of the questions that are coming through. So don't be afraid to drop a comment into the comment section, and we'll bring some of those out and tease them through as we go through today. But let's dive into some of the meat of today's topic then. We're talking about performance management, and we're talking about coaching in a hybrid, remote, virtual, bricks and mortar environment, and how we start to navigate some of those topics. And historically, performance management, I suppose, has had a negative connotation to it. And I want to explore, why do we think that is? And do we think it's still viewed in the same light? So I'm going to ask Helen for your thoughts first, and then Danny, I'd be really interested in your perspective as well. So what's your view, Helen?
Yeah, I think it's small wonder really that historically it's had negative connotations. I think we've been really heavily focused in the contact center world anyway on quite punitive measures for a start. I think we're all conditioned to see performance management as largely picking up on poor performance, maybe even implementing disciplinary action. So thinking about it, performance management tempts me to hark back to my own times on the phone. Now, I was at uni, and as we were discussing before the session started, that was about a million years ago. But also, I think much more recently than that, sadly, I think most agents felt or even feel like, they experience it as constantly being watched, maybe judged on rigid metrics, average handle time, how many calls we're grinding through. And I certainly never experienced any real focus on the quality of conversations when I was an agent, really. I think historically there's been a lot of fear sloshing around the word performance management. And I think it's fair to say it's been synonymous with watching colleagues, watching them getting a telling off, or even I've
Catching
seen them
people
get
out.
that. Yeah, right. Catching people out rather than catching people doing things right, rather than having a focus on improvement, on growth, or heaven forbid, driving good outcomes. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think there's some really interesting concepts that you talked about. And I like the phrase that you used there, catch you doing it right. When I was working in the operation, we used to have specific catch you doing it right days rather than catching you out all of the time, which sometimes, certainly from a QA perspective, it can often feel like. Danny, do you agree with Helen there? Do you think it's do you think it's still viewed in a negative light or from a negative perspective?
Unfortunately, for both our questions, yes. How it's come about, I have some theories around this. So there's a quote that's attributed to Peter Drucker, which is what gets measured gets managed.
Gets done.
One of my favorites.
I know it's an incomplete quote.
Yeah,
Peter Drucker didn't say that.
totally.
He actually said what gets measured gets managed, even if what gets measured shouldn't be measured or managed, and even if it's detrimental to the business. So the full phrase means it kind of reorientates you to, are you measuring the right things?
Yeah.
That then was taken on, that was sort of in the 50s, that was then taken on by people like Jack Welch with Rank and Yank and virtuous cycles of over rewarding our top performers and removing the bottom performers. And those kind of cultural elements and limiting beliefs of what good looks like and how to get performance out of people still permeate today. And we still have contact centers that use phrases like what gets measured gets managed.
Yeah, I think there's another really good Peter Drucker quote, and you might even expand on that one, but it's measure what matters. And I think when you put measure what matters together and what gets measured gets managed, it really kind of brings the holistic view of, are we measuring the right things that are material to agents, material to customers, and having the positive impacts that drive the business, I suppose. But I think when you put the two together, it gives you a real complete picture. And I'm of the same opinion as both of you. I think it has historically been seen negatively. I think there is still culture out there that has more stick than carrot. And I'm interested in anybody who's watching in terms of what's your perceptions in the contact center life. Is performance management still seen as something that your agents fear and dread, or is it seen as a tool to help them grow and get better? And I think when we start to talk about performance management, we can start to look at both the formal and the informal views of performance management. And I think perhaps that kind of formal-esque performance management piece is maybe what strikes fear into agents' hearts when people drag them into a room for some feedback. And I'm interested in your views, Helen, and we'll kind of debate this as a group, but I'm interested when you start to think about the journey that you go on from a performance management perspective, and people move from an informal to a formal perspective. How do we make sure people know what good looks like when managing that agent through an informal and formal process? What's your thoughts?
That's a great question. I think basically you make that shift from formal either when there's, a really clear policy trigger, something that's baked into your performance management policy, like, I don't know, a certain number of compliance failures that get picked up in the QA process, or super high absence, or frankly, when someone's performance risks, their behaviour risks impacting on operations or on compliance. That's what we're talking about there. Serious customer complaints, need for redress, sustained compliance issues. That's kind of worst case, hopefully. But I think thankfully, in the vast majority of cases, informal feedback is the best first step, simple kind of coaching session, casual one-on-one chats, but with clear and kind expectation setting is key. So that informal coaching is great, but when it's clearly not having the desired effect, that's when we're seeing issues continue despite us really our best efforts in the informal space, those informal interventions. That's our cue as leaders. So we have to be alive to knowing when to take that more formal route, and I'd say it's around clarity of communication. It's key here to make sure that we aren't being too woolly about the stage we're at when we do make that shift, that transition, and that we're telling that team member, albeit kindly, and kind being the word that I keep bringing forward, that we are moving to a more formal and structured stage with potentially a documented plan in place for improvement.
And I'm going to pick out two words that you use there, which I think are absolutely key to this. And then, Danny, I'm going to invite your thoughts on that informal and formal stage. But I think you talked about performance expectations. And I think for me, sometimes that's where performance management and feedback and coaching starts to fail, because we've not been really clear from the outset what those performance expectations are. So people move from informal to formal at a rate of knots, and they've got whiplash because what they thought was right was suddenly not right. So Danny, in kind of talking about that, do you agree with that? And what's your views on how we transition somebody from an informal state to a formal state, and when should that kick in?
So I think you're both absolutely correct. That's the reality of the move from informal to formal can feel very kind of jarring. But you've both kind of danced around exactly the same point, which is around, for me, around intentionality. Just because a process is informal doesn't mean it doesn't have to have the intent behind it. This is what we're trying to achieve. This is what we're trying to address. And often the informal process doesn't have that, so it feels woolly. So when you move from an informal to a formal process, now you've got intention and protocol, and that's that whiplash effect. So for me, the informality or the informal process should still be rooted in the intent and set expectations. And yes, we're maybe not going to follow documentation approach. The second thing is that comes into my mind is that performance is an outcome. And often, going back to what we measure, we manage, we tend to be, you're not hitting this KPI, your conversion, your sales is not high enough. And that then drives the conversation of get your conversion up to an acceptable amount, rather than what are the behaviors that are going to encourage that. If you have a child, for example, that is missing their grades at school, you wouldn't sit them down in a formal meeting, go through a PowerPoint presentation on how to
speak for yourself. Sorry,
you've clearly not been parented by Helen.
you go through the behaviors. What is it that's struggling with? What is it? A confidence thing? Is it a capability thing? Is it that you don't feel comfortable that you can kind of do something a little bit different and try something new because you might be ostracized by the tribe? And it's those sort of things that, having the KPI attached to it and having a layer of management that may not be comfortable with having conversations and know what good coaching looks like, that actually gets in the way. And then it becomes almost it's not me that's having this conversation, it's the process means I have to have the conversation.
Yeah, it's hiding behind a process sometimes, isn't it? Because we're afraid to have that difficult conversation. I'm just going to show the comment that Morris Pencil has put onto the kind of the comments, and I think this is really true, I think, and I think it underpins some of the things that we've just been saying there around ease of data to access, and sometimes having that data underpins the conversation. We have a data-driven conversation rather than a person-driven conversation. So I think there's sometimes a risk in over-indexing on data. But what I like here is what Morris has said is the test that Morris works for is asking what good examples have you identified and how you use them. So pulling out that best practice and pulling out those examples of perhaps where it's not meeting that particular standard, would be a really, really good acid test for any manager. Sitting down, thinking about having a performance management conversation to start to understand that. So really, thanks very much for joining, Maurice, and thanks very much for your comment.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point, isn't it? And it goes back to that catching people doing things right, you know. So if we're finding an and kind of sharing examples of where we're seeing excellence, so celebrating those kind of, you know, real world successes of the team getting things right, that does flip that traditional negative view of performance management on its head, you know. So
Absolutely.
it could look like compiling an excellence library. You know, we know that people tend to more readily accept our learnings and our suggestions if it feels really, you know, relatable to them rather than conceptual. So if we can listen to real examples of a team member delivering, you know, a really solid objection handle, or, you know, really effectively managing expectations or educating a customer, you know, that can be really powerful. So I think that's an excellent point. I think he's bang on. Thank you, Maurice.
Brilliant. And I think one of the things that we've then got as we start to, I suppose, go through some of those conversations and start to ask people about how performance is tracking is, how do we start to think about what the drivers of some of that underperformance is? And whilst I ask this question, I'm just going to bring up Chris's comment around what we measure and what we don't measure. And Chris is talking about measuring call handling times. And I think the question that I've got, and I'm going to start with you, Helen, is when we start thinking about some of the behaviors and some of the metrics and some of the data that we use, what are you seeing as some of the drivers of underperformance in people? And how do we focus more on behavior outputs, as Danny said, and role modeling, rather than beating people up with a stick because the data says X? So what's your thoughts? And then Danny, really interested to get your thoughts on the behavioural aspect too. So let's start with yourself, Helen.
Thanks. So yeah, I think at the risk of sounding like a trainer with a hammer and seeing every problem as like a training shaped nail, I think there are several drivers of underperformance, but it's probably not controversial that I believe that one of the biggest ones is you know, a lack of training or development. You know, be that the more kind of human skill set. I'm talking about, you know, active listening, EQ, specifically empathy, all those harder skills like, you know, our tech training, you know, tool use, maybe product specs. And then another biggie is probably low engagement. So if we can't see a way forward as a team member, if there's no, you know, kind of clear progression path, or we're simply not being supported or celebrated for our efforts, as we've been talking about already, we probably aren't going to be inclined to be giving it our all. So, you know, we've got to think about those things. And then sometimes it's driven by external factors, right? You know, life circumstances, maybe physical or mental health challenges, they can play a big part, but they're only going to get picked up on if we are having regular coaching conversations, actively building relationship with our team members. So I said a lot there, but there's this is really a point of passion for me.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think, Danny, from your perspective, as obviously an organizational psychologist and someone who focuses on behaviors, there's obviously some key parts of agent engagement and agent motivation and team leader input there. So what's your thoughts on the behavioral aspects of what might be driving underperformance in agents' behavior?
A great question, and there's a couple of things that popped into my head. The first is, as a group, us three have referred to agents multiple times. Performance management is across the entire business. We unintentionally have this othering language that makes it's a them issue, not an us issue. So we need to be cognizant of that, first of all. The second is, what behaviours do you want? And often businesses don't focus on the why we're here, what's that vision, what's that North Star we're heading towards, and then what are the behaviours that are going to help us create the environment and support our organizational strategy. So instead, we look for people that have the behaviours that we like. Let's make it a fun place. Let's make it, everybody needs to have high technical knowledge. Everybody has to be able to show vulnerability and emotions and build rapport with customers. But not everybody can have every skill. Not everybody can have all of the tools for every context and every conversation and every touch point and every interaction. That's unreasonable. So how do we identify what are the suite of absolute behaviors that we need that lead to the performances that we require? That's the first step. The second is then, what are the processes, the protocols, the tools, the training, the L&D, Helen, that we can help to identify and develop those behaviours, and where there are gaps, is it that we need to try and build those behaviours, or is that group of individuals, actually their behaviour be a superpower elsewhere in our business or elsewhere in the customer journey? So what do you want, and then how do you get it, tends to be the missing pieces of the recipe that we don't pay attention to, and then we only apply that recipe to the coal face, not to our first line managers or operations managers.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, sometimes does the problem lie with the team leader not doing the things that are going to drive agent behaviour and drive the right outcomes? And there's a phrase that I always use, and I got this from a sales capability program that I went through in my very formative contact center years, and it was inspect what you expect. So being really clear about what your expectations are, and then following through and making sure that those things are actually happening to the standard that you expect or foresee them to happen. Helen, I'm going to come to you for this next question, because it's around some of the performance management frameworks that we use, or perhaps that are absent sometimes in managing performance. And I want to discuss with you what models and frameworks perhaps you've worked with when working within teams to enhance performance and personal development, and how we avoid some of the get them out or get them up or get them out conversations. So what's your experience of kind of different modalities of performance management, I suppose, that you've used in the past that may have been successful or unsuccessful?
Well, this is where I'd love to say I've got some shiny new framework to unveil. But in my experience, working with teams in contact centres for a long time, models and frameworks, they're 10 a penny. I think they often come down to managerial preference. But there are some that are really enduring. They might be pretty old school, but I think they prevail because they have value. What's that quote? All models are flawed, but some are very useful. And I think that's probably the disclaimer here. When I wheel out, SBI, SMART, Grow, Skill, Will, a couple, they're oldies but goodies, but they do tend to work and actually deliver results, in my opinion. They're quite easy to implement and then to, kind of get working well and see them going forward. So if there's anything I've said there that anyone wants any extra clarity on, let me know. But again, because none of them are really new news, I think probably people are quite familiar with them.
Yeah, and we love a good skill will matrix, and situational leadership has always been my favorite go-to, to say, right, how do we start to understand what people's development curve is, and then what approach to do. Danny, as the psychologist among us, you'll be familiar with a framework or two. Is there anything that you would want to add on to that in terms of frameworks that might work, or things that by using a framework might bring our downfall, perhaps?
So I'll share with you a real story of when I was a team leader. So I was an experienced team leader in a sales channel at a large telecoms company. Check my profile. I'm not going to say who it is. And we had an estate change. We moved teams around, and they did this once every sort of 8 or 9 months. They had this belief of this sort of new brush sweeps cleaner, and there's a thing called the Hawthorne effect, where you get a little spike in performance. However, I was a particular type of manager, very high performing, and I was given a team and explicitly told, these are problem children, get them off or get them out. Yeah. And I don't believe that at all. You know me, Gary. My mantra number 2 is nobody comes to work wanting to do a bad job. So when a bad job happens, what is it that's causing that? What's the behaviours that are being driven? And this particular team, they had 12 KPIs each, so KPIs, which included things like AHT, which I know has popped up in the chat. Yeah. There is no way you can have 12 key performance indicators. They can't all be key. So I did 2 changes as a team leader, frontline team leader in operation. First is we reduced the KPI suite down, even though they were still being measured, even though the commission payments were still being worked on at the same KPI suite. We only talked about 2 KPIs. The first was TMPS. So what was the customer experience for your touch point? Would they recommend this particular provider based on their brand experience? And the second one was your talk efficiency. So how much time do you spend talking versus on wrap, etc. So that was to make sure that it was a protective measure, to make sure that people weren't avoiding having conversations, etc. As they had where they were ready to take the calls, And then we measured the output of, was the customer happier when they left the call than when they joined?
Yeah.
The second change we made was in coaching sessions, we never did anything to do with call listening. So we never listened to any calls at all. Instead, I listened to the starts and ends of calls to verify that the customer left in a better position than they started. The compliance team would look after, all your DPA checks being done and all that kind of stuff. So I didn't need to do that. And the second thing that we did, and part of that second thing in the call listening was, what are you going to work on for next week? What do you struggle with today? What makes you uncomfortable today? That team went from the bottom performing, we've given up on these people and we expect you to get them out, to the top performing team. And we never once looked at conversion, at volume of sales, at margin, at profit, at AHT. We don't need to, because those are results of having great conversations that you're not avoiding and always looking for what makes me uncomfortable and how to be better.
Yeah.
So it's not a framework, but having team leaders that have the environment that allows them to challenge and do something that can be seen as a bit radical, that's the real key to it. Not a specific framework, not specific conflict management conversations, etc. It's that, do I have the environment that allows me to measure what matters, to talk about what matters?
And it's that behavioral piece as well, isn't it? It's like, actually, what are the behaviors that are going to drive the output? So things like, you need to increase your conversion. Actually, increasing conversion is an output of something. What are the activities? What are the behaviors? What are the words? What are the actions that need to happen as a result of that? And everybody we're all human, aren't we? And I think there's a comment in the chat, and I think echoes your point around using that agent term, Danny. Is all people are people, and they all have different needs, different requirements, and you spoke about the lifestyle impacts, Helen, and some of the issues that might be affecting people that might be temporarily putting them into a more vulnerable space, that actually then might impact their performance. But if we go by the letter of the law and say, you've missed 3 targets in a row, we're going to put you on a PIP, or we're going to put you on a performance plan, and then we're going to take you to capability, we're missing out on that human element of what's going on in people's lives, and what might be impacting some of that. And I think that supports, I suppose, some of the stuff that links to the next question, Danny, which is, I'm going to start with you. It's about creating that environment where people feel comfortable enough to challenge and feel like they can trust somebody to have a conversation and tell people what's happening. And I think sometimes performance shifts because people aren't comfortable talking about what's happening in their lives. And that's about that psychological safe environment. So how do we make sure that environment is right so that agents can challenge leaders and leaders can challenge agents and do that constructively? What's the dynamic that needs to happen in the contact center environment, or any business that's doing performance management, that means that they can have those safe and honest conversations?
So I know I've used this example before, because we need to know what is the environment that we need that's going to nurture the behaviors. And what we tend to do is, if you imagine a workplace that's fun and exciting and energetic, and we have a win machine where you can grab gift vouchers based on your performance, under the desk, and we all dress up in our football kits on a Friday and go to the pub. Isn't that the sort of place you want to work? Well, congratulations, you're an awful funeral directors. The behaviors that you need in X business will be different to Y. So start out with, what is it that you're trying to achieve, and then what's the environment that's going to nurture that? You take the Army's culture of low opacity but high trust in the person next to you, siloed, and put that into Google, you stop all innovation. If you take Google's innovative climate and put that in the Army, then some borders are going to change. So what do you want to achieve first of all, and then what is the environment that's going to nurture those behaviors? That's the first thing. When it comes to actually creating the kind of psychological safety, which is a bit of a buzz phrase at the moment, is psychological safety isn't something you create. It's something other people feel. And you could have a metaphorical room that you think is completely safe. People that come into that room, some of them will still feel unsafe because they don't exist in a vacuum. They will bring their life experiences and so on with them. So it's not as simple as, I've got an open door policy, and you can contribute to an employee survey anonymously, and so it's not about the environment you create, it's how people feel subjectively about that environment.
Yeah.
What you can do is increase the likelihood of it feeling like it's okay for me to put my hand up and say I've got an idea or I disagree. Um, Incentivize those things. How do you recognize that if you require failure in your business, so if you need innovation, you will fail it. So how do you encourage people to put their hand up? Okay, and how do you hold your nerve when your KPIs go, wow, we've got loads of mistakes happening. We've had an acceleration in the things that have gone wrong. Well, of course you have. People are feeling more safe to put their hands up. So long meandering answer. The first one is, what are the behaviors that you need? Don't just assume that if you create a commune, if you create a great place to work, that it's going to be a place where great work is done, because that is not the same thing.
Yeah, and I think actually that whole piece around a great place to work is subjective around the people, isn't it? It's like, actually, who tells you it's a great place to work? It's your people.
You've been round the block to work at Twitter.
Yeah.
But he's been very open that he's going to shout at you. You're going to be sleeping in the office.
Yeah.
He's still got because he's very transparent about this is the day-to-day lived experience of being at work.
And what about your thoughts, Helen, in terms of things that leaders need to do to help create that trusted environment then? How do leaders need to change their views and their perceptions of performance management in order to allow people to be comfortable to fail, to maybe drop down in performance and then rise back up like a phoenix from the ashes? What do leaders need to do to create that environment that's going to help people thrive?
Yeah, I've just been sycophantically nodding along to everything Danny's been saying. So I do kind of defer to him in areas of psychological safety. But if I were to add my two pennies, I think we have to, as leaders, model the behaviours that we want to see. And I know that sounds quite trite, but it really means being open about our own fallibility. Is that a word? It is now. Like just letting our team see that we're always learning too. Not being brittle. Know it all. We want to be learn it all, not know it all. Something that I like to say quite a bit, but it really sets people up to see that even as leaders, even bosses should be continually learning things, evolving. Empathy, actual two-way dialogue where we don't just say that we have, as Danny mentioned, an open door, but we really then are prepared to really hear what people are telling us, even if we don't like it. And then talking and walking the talk is really vital, I think. So we've got to make sure that everybody feels confident to express their ideas, and then be able to fail as well without fear of judgment or repercussion. So quite lofty, but it starts with us, I think, ultimately is what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. And we're going to move into a conversation in a second just around some of those human and behavioral economics, which I know, Danny, you are a big fan of. But before we do that, I just want to bring in a couple of comments from the chat. One from Graham Bunting, which is around technology. And I think this is an interesting one. It's saying, how can we leverage technology to support the agent conversation and the performance conversation? And Graham's agreeing with Carolyn Jordan, who's been on the call as well, saying, I agree the use of contact center technology grows into new places, maybe businesses using digital and calls in a blended way. That becomes relevant as agent is unreliable. So he's talking about that agent term and that human piece, but he's also referencing how we can use contact center technology to bolster some of those conversations and some of those performance conversations. So, Helen, what's your experience from BPA quality? And this is a bit of an on the hoof one, so I'm going to give you a second to think. But what's your experience in BPA of using technology so that leaders can have better conversations with agents, and agents can be more empowered to have better conversations because of the technology? What's your view?
Yeah, I think, I think that we can be facilitated to be more collaborative when we're using things like Teams and Slack and, those kind of dashes where we can see goals and performance aspirations kind of laid out for us in a way that's going to make us all able to then see, well, where were we? What did we say then? In a way that's, I think, maybe even better, an improvement on how it was in the past. That's where my mind goes immediately. And secondly, that it behooves us as managers to make sure that we're abreast of that kind of technology as well. That I'm maybe speaking from personal experience there, but it's not okay to just let your team go first. You've got to really take the bull by the horns and make sure that you're au fait.
Yeah, absolutely. And Danny, what's your thoughts around how technology can play a role in performance management and empowerment of agents? People. Empowerment of
Again,
people.
of all of us, yes. So again, a couple of thoughts kind of popped into my head as Helen is very much the expert on the kind of tech side of this. My first is that I've been in contact centres for a long time, unfortunately, 30-ish years, and it's the same conversations that we're having today, despite technology moving on at ridiculous rates. It's still about um, do agents feel that they matter? Do our people feel that they matter? What they do make a difference? Do customers feel that they're getting the right service and values being added? And it doesn't matter if we have shiny new AI tools or IVRs that came in the 90s or printers that came in the 70s. We've still got the same challenges in the output.
Yeah.
So for me, technology is not a solution. Technology is an enabler. So you need the combination of what is the tools that you need, or what are the tools that you need. Technology is one of those. Great. Do you have people trained to use those tools?
Yeah.
Or is it just a shiny that, we can save some money by diverting our customers this way, for example, or I can save having to have difficult conversations in coaching, in feedback sessions by getting the bot to kind of do it for me. So that's kind of the popped into my head.
You know what? I agree as well. I think it's also calling a spade when you're implementing technology to help save on efficiency and perhaps resources, is call it that for that, rather than saying, it's a shiny new tool that's going to help you do X, Y, Z. When actually the reality is we're introducing it because we want to make a saving on headcount. That's going to mean X, Y, Z. So I think it's being transparent with the application of technology, but also leveraging the benefits that it can bring to both leaders, both frontline teams, and help support customers to do different things that are going to help the people that are handling those customers on a day-to-day basis achieve better outcomes for customers. So that's the key thing. I think there's another one. Morris is on fire today. So Morris has talked about hiring for attitude and train the skills approach. So when we talk about performance management, and we often refer to this as people over time underperforming, and as a result we performance manage them. I think there's an argument to say right fit, right role, and how do we start to think about the people that we've got? Are they doing the right role in the first place, and do we redeploy people who potentially may be struggling? But actually I think it goes back to a start point around what is the onboarding, and what's the onboarding process that's going to help people find the right role for them. So I'm really interested in your thoughts on Morris's comment here around start with hiring for attitudes and train the skills approach, and that drives less of a blame culture into the performance and skills. And Danny, I'm going to come to you on this one to start with, and then Helen, I'm really interested in your perspective as well. So what's your initial thoughts on this one, Danny?
I love the implication of I want to know who's to blame for this blame culture. It's thick with irony. It's an interesting one because on the surface, I agree. Skills are teachable if the person wants to learn those skills as well. But how do you measure attitude? How do you measure someone's personality, their learned behaviours, and how they're going to exhibit those in any given context? And that's a really challenging question, even for a psychologist. That's a challenging question. And if I knew that I had to go in for surgery, do I want a really happy-go-lucky, full of spunk surgeon, or do I want the one that actually knows what they're doing? And it's that careful balance between do we know what we want in terms of attitude, and how do we even know if we've got that? And at the end of the day, we're commercial ventures that need to make sure that we're delivering a specific skill that delivers a service to customers. So on the surface, yes, I agree. It's much easier to train skills than it is to create attitude. However, and Morris has touched on it, creating the culture that supports the behaviours that you want. If you want people to take regulation seriously, then you don't have cultures that allow people to, it's going to be dressed down, I'm going to pull tables, I'm going to fly around the cell, because that sends a subliminal message that actually this is much more of a clan. We're a family type culture, and it's okay to let things slide. So what behaviours do you need, and then how do you create the environment that nurtures and encourages those behaviours and attracts and retains those sort of people? And how do you hold your nerve when you realise some of those people are suitable, then they leave at their own accord.
Yeah. And that attitude piece, I think, is a really interesting one. I think it was Gary V that said it once, and I'm not going to swear live on air, but you can guess where I'm going. He says, "I'd rather have a hole than an a-hole." And that's a really interesting piece, isn't it? Say, right, that bad apple can potentially drive a myriad of problems later on down the line.
It's the ownership as well that I've had conversations multiple times, but I remember having a conversation with a business owner about, I've got this person in my business and they're a bad apple. My first protocol, because I'm an idealist and I believe that nobody wants to work on to do a bad job, is, were they a hole when you hired them, or did they become a hole on your watch?
Because of your culture, yeah.
Yeah, and it holds a mirror up to say, what is it that we actually want? What are we trying to achieve? Or you just Dave left, so you've replaced Dave with a Dave-shaped person, and he's not like Dave, and now somehow that's the new person's fault. What have you done to nurture that person, to nurture the environment?
And what's your thoughts, Helen? Because I know in interviews, and you've probably done just as many as I've done, and spent many a time interviewing somebody that says, right, when you ask them you're underperforming against your targets, what do you do differently? Well, I do this. I'd spend extra time doing that. I'd do more hours. And that, I suppose, is what you want to hear in an interview. Does it ever really translate when we're starting to performance manage people? So what's your thoughts on that skills and attitude and hiring policy?
I think that Danny's bang on. It's much easier to measure objectively somebody's level of skill than it is to really understand how willing they are to do something. So it's really important. I think that we can focus on those old friends, like active listening, effective questioning, empathy, that are going to guide us to the right outcomes ultimately, rather than those winning behaviours, rather than just having this myopic focus, this lens on the output, when we're just all about the AHT rather than thinking, well, was this a good conversation? So slightly broader brush there, but basically just in agreement with Danny.
Yeah. And Danny, we talked a lot today about behaviours and the behavioural shift that people need to take when they're going through that performance management cycle, I suppose. But what would you say are some of the practical things that leaders can use to motivate contact centre employees and influence performance more positively?
I've talked a lot, so I'll just say care. It starts really simply.
Actually care about your people.
Yeah, generally not care because your commission depends on it, or because you've got targets to hit, or if one of your people, whether it's a peer, whether it's your line manager, or whether it's one of your reports, if they broke down on the way home from work, would you be comfortable, or would they be comfortable ringing you and asking for help? I know it's a very subjective kind of example, but it's a good sort of litmus test to say, this person has my well-being at heart. They care about what I do. And that's the basis of trust. If there is no trust, then you encourage an environment that becomes transactional. So I'll be compliant. I'll do enough not to get sacked. I'll hit my numbers, but I won't be committed. I'm not part of something bigger than myself. And tied into that is, how can I be part of something bigger than myself if I don't know why we exist as an organization? What are we trying to achieve? What is that vision? What is that North Star? And what are the behaviours? I feel like a broken record here, but what are the behaviours that are going to support the delivery of that? So care. It's Taylor's all the time.
And you know what? I think sometimes you have to care across all levels as well, because the work that the team leader does is often a reflection of the demands and the pressures that their manager's putting on them and their manager's putting on them. And I had a manager once who will remain nameless, but she was lovely. But she used to say to me, "OBC, that one, Gary." I was like, "What's OBC?" She's like, "Out before Christmas." So there was pressure, pressure from your manager to manage other people and do what you think is right, rather than what your manager is telling you. So the OBC school of management should not exist. Would you agree, Helen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with Danny that nobody goes to work to do a bad job. I truly believe that. And he talked about care. I said earlier about kindness, and I think with kindness it can be seen as being quite fluffy, but in my experience, it's absolutely not that at all. It's about being very clear. It's about, you know, a high support and high challenge model and a way of operating with our team members. So people really feel, yes, I have your back, I will support you, and I have high expectations for you.
Yeah.
You know, I will challenge you. So
Yeah.
it's about setting those core conditions for people. Yeah,
absolutely. And you know where I see a lot of team leaders fall down is they've not done that contracting piece up front.
right. Yeah,
They've not sat people down and say, listen, I'm firm but fair is often a phrase that gets used. But when you translate that into real language, it's like, listen, I've got your back. I'll support you. I'll coach you. I'll develop you. I'll give you feedback. But what I need from you is I need you to commit 100%. I need you to give your absolute A game. I need you to bring the right attitude. I need to show up on time and do the work that's required of us and work well as a team. And there's not enough of that contracting that happens up front. So I want to kind of shift the conversation a little bit towards that contracting and coaching piece and how important that is in performance management avoidance, I suppose that formal piece, and that ongoing performance management that I suppose is that positive aspect that we want to bring to performance management. So people feel like performance management is a positive thing rather than, oh, I'm being coached because I'm on a plan, is where I often kind of hear that coming through. So I'm going to start with you, Helen, on this question around how we create a coaching culture, and how do we make sure that organizations have a coaching culture that's applied from the bottom up and top down across the patch. And then Danny, I'm interested in your thoughts as well from an organizational perspective. So Helen, how do we create a coaching culture in our teams?
I think there's so many threads, and I suppose it stands to reason that a lot of the things we've talked about, you know, to Danny's point about being like a stuck record, it is about that psychological safety, about making sure that we're in real dialogue and having a inquisitive kind of mindset where we're asking great questions, we're not afraid to fail. So yeah, quite again, broad brush, but really you've got to, like you said, set those core conditions, have that contracting in place where it's not just something that we say, it's something that we really do. So I'll let Danny speak more to that, but I think it's really important that we walk the talk and that we are willing to be coached ultimately as well.
Absolutely. And I think you're right there, is that we see the coaching relationship sometimes as leader to frontline rather than leader to leader or head of to frontline leader to from CEO to coaching a frontline team member. So I think that's what's going to change it culturally. Danny, what's your worldly wise view on that?
So I'm not sure how worldly wise it is, but as usual, I've got lots of bits that have popped up. So as they come out of my head, I'll explain. Performance management is everyone. In an ideal world, everybody would be on a performance improvement plan, I think. But that would get rid of some of the negative connotations around it. But ultimately, that's what everyone's there for. From the CEO down, is there to perform and get better. So you can remove the stigma by doing that. That then requires coaching. And for me, it starts with, what is coaching? I think a lot of new managers get mentorship and coaching mixed up. Mentorship is, this is my experience, I'm a sounding board, I'm going to challenge you on some of your beliefs, but it's a very it's a relational kind of tool. Coaching is, here is a specific goal that we are working on, and here is a framework that I am using. And yes, the language might change and be adapted to suit the audience, but ultimately, if you use something like growth, for example, you are following a step-by-step proven methodology that has a very specific outcome at the end of it.
Yeah.
And I've seen lots of coaching sessions that have no coaching. They are sounding board, how are you doing? You could sound friendly.
Feedback sessions,
ask for the business. So I think investment in line managers particularly on how to coach, on what coaching is, and that it comes from a place of kindness, as Helen said, that kindness isn't wishy-washy and let's go and have a coffee chat. I expect more. That's why we're having to have these sometimes uncomfortable conversations, because they're coming from a good place. And what can I learn from this as the coach from you?
Yeah. You know what? I had another manager in my life who wasn't an out before Christmas person, but he said to me once. He said, if the reaction from the person that you're having a coaching conversation or a feedback conversation or a performance driven conversation is a surprise, then that's your fault. Right. You've not done enough to manage that person's expectation. You've not been regular and little and often in terms of your feedback. You've not been clear enough in your expectations. It's on you as the leader if their reaction is a negative one. And that I internalize that a lot. And I think that's kind of driven a lot of the way that I have managed people in the past, is say, right, actually, it's my responsibility to make sure that you're aware of my expectations and that you are working in a way that aligns with that, and that I'm providing you the right level of support.
So spot on there with the idea it's on us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we think about that coaching culture piece, Helen, what do you see as maybe some of the blockers that's stopping leaders really adopting that and kind of bringing it to the front?
Again, at the risk of sounding like a stuck record from a training perspective, we owe our team members real coaching conversations, but like Danny alluded to, often they're not real coaching conversations. They're check-ins, they're one-to-ones, they're chats over coffee, which are great and have their place in the world. But we've got to be upskilling our team members in what is coaching, and how do we deliver on it? Because otherwise we're doing the team members a disservice, but also ourselves, and we're not going to see the outcomes that we want. So.
Yeah, and I think, and this is a contentious point, but I would put out there, has coaching and feedback and performance management changed or become more difficult in the environment that we're in now? So we obviously went through a tumultuous period that was COVID, that shifted how we had to work and how we had to have conversations, and the types of conversations that we had, whether it was used to be face-to-face, now it's all remote. Has that conversation now become harder? So are people now shirking away from those conversations and shirking away from coaching because they don't like doing it in a virtual format? Interested in your thoughts, starting Helen.
Thank you so much. No, I think you're right. It's easier to shirk it, isn't it? I think if we're in this hybrid or fully remote world, then coaching definitely needs a bit more rigor applied to it. I don't mean so much in our kind of core style as a coach, as in very clear comms. So I'm sure everybody's sick at this point after the pandemic in the played out phrase, water cooler moments. But there is definitely, if we are working remotely or in a hybrid way, there's less opportunity for very casual in-person conversations, that kind of on the fly coaching by walking around type feedback that we historically saw in contact centres. So we have to be more structured right off the bat. And that might mean, we've got to set more explicit goals, I think, so people really clearly understand what's expected. We've talked about, having the right KPIs in place so people aren't being forced to make compromises against, what they're being measured against versus what they're actually delivering for the customer. And it absolutely looks like really regular check-ins to bridge any gaps that we're seeing left by that lack of water cooler moments, those informal interactions with our team members. So I think Danny mentioned earlier being more intentional, more deliberate about staying connected with people in the new world, or in our case at BPA, it's not our agents, it's with our analysts, and we've got to be really explicit about the why behind goals and expectations. And there are a variety of ways we can do that in this world, but that's my kind of headline part there.
Definitely agree. Danny, what's your thoughts on that shift in virtual from in-person moments? Do you think that has a material impact or not?
Yes, but possibly not for the reason that we think. So just to circle back on Helen's, I was going to say intentional. It's not just communicate more and tell everybody everything, or have multiple check-ins just for the sake of it. What is the intent? What are you trying to achieve? Is it to show that you care? Is it to build a relationship? Is it because you've got some coaching to do? Is it because you need some advice? But be explicit and intentional in what you're trying to do. because all of the nuance of the side by side, a water cooler moments, coffee chats, we lose.
Yeah.
So just to echo Helen, 100% agree. From a more kind of psychological point of view, we haven't really changed as people for 200,000 years. So our reactions are still the same. There's no redundancy in our brain. There's no bit in our brain that says, Steve wants a coaching session with me, I'm sure it'll be okay. It's either a mortal threat or it's not. And 200,000 years ago, if you were ostracized from the tribe, if you were kicked out of the tribe, it was a literal death sentence.
Yeah.
And if you think in those terms, even if you're not a psychologist, if you think in those terms, how do you reduce the reaction from people where you're saying, I have the intent to have this coaching session, the intent to do X, Y, and Z. The challenge is that because we've put a layer between ourselves and the person we're coaching through technology, we are removing some of the emotional connection and the responsibility for that conversation.
Yeah.
So I'll give you a working example. I have a coaching a small business owner who's really warm and friendly and what we call highly agreeable. But as a trade-off, she finds it really hard to have red lines and ask for the business and chase payments and so on. So having those conversations one-to-one, she finds really hard. She has to kind of get a game face on and build her energy up before she can do it. So what she's doing now is she's writing down, what have I got to say? All those arguments you have in the shower, she's writing those down because that now creates one step separation between what's in my head and what have I got to do. Now, inadvertently, by going to a hybrid world, we've got the same situation happening. I may genuinely care about somebody I'm about to have this conversation with, but because I have this delineation, separation between me and the conversation, me and the interaction, actually you remove some of that emotional connection, some of the trust, currency, and social capital that we might have built up, which is why you need to be more intentional. Don't have one Zoom call with 4 different purposes. This conversation is about this, and this is what I want to get out. This is how I can support you, and this is why it's important.
Yeah, and you know what? I think there is also, and I've said this with other people that I've worked with, is say not every conversation has to be a Teams conversation or a Zoom's conversation. Actually, just pick up the telephone, which is mobile, and walk around and have a conversation. Go and get some fresh air. Have a walking one-to-one or a walking coaching.
Can I give you another example of an exercise I do, which is just 5 words, 5 written words, given our prevalence for text messaging and email and Slack and so on. And the phrase is, I didn't break the vase. It's just 5 words, and it can't be misconstrued, apparently. Okay, so we're going to emphasize one word. I didn't break the vase. 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 You've got 6 different meanings just from one sentence. So pick up the phone, get some of that nuance back in your tonality, and do it intentionally.
Have you been earwigging in some of my training sessions for me?
Are you breaking vases in your training?
No, I'm saying I didn't say she stole the money, but same difference.
We are fast approaching the hour, so I want to leave our listeners and viewers with one tidbit from each of you. So I'm going to ask you in around 60 seconds if there was one piece of advice you'd give new and emerging managers who might be struggling with performance issues or coaching. What would your top tip be? Helen, I'm going to come to you first, which gives you an extra 30 seconds to think, Danny. So what would your top tip be, Helen?
Well, I know when we spoke about this initially, I raised that stat from the Chartered Institute of Managers that I think it's 82% of new managers are, as they call them, accidental managers. So they've been promoted without having any formal training or development for that particular role. So I think the antidote there, if that feels familiar, is to, and again, it's the same themes, the greatest hits here, but really powerful, is just to commit to being a learner, develop yourself, and just make sure that we are really, taking ownership of our own professional development and then modeling what we want to see in our team as well.
100%. Commit to being a learner. Always be a learner, I say. Fantastic. Danny, if you were to give your top tip?
2 sides to this, as I always give. The first is assume positive intent. Everybody is trying to do the best they can. That doesn't mean they do the best. They might be way off the mark. That applies for everybody around you, in the public and in work. So assume positive intent, because it opens your mind to, when I see a behavior I disagree with or a performance item I don't think is acceptable, what is it that made that behavior normalized and acceptable? It might not be the behavior, it might be I'm avoiding doing X or I'm uncomfortable doing Y, or I thought that's how we get things done around here. And the second part of that goes what Helen said. Assume of yourself that you're an unfinished product. There's always things that you can choose to learn. You don't have to learn everything, but you'll never know what you don't know unless you ask that of yourself.
Yeah.
And you can read as many books as you want, but unless you know how to read yourself, unless you know have some self-awareness, you're missing out on all of this.
Love a bit of AI. Brilliant. Well, that takes us right smack bang to the top of the hour. So all that is left for me to do is to say thank you very much to everybody who has dropped a comment and made some contributions into the chat. It really helps stimulate some of the conversation here, and I think lots of people take stuff away from that. Thank you very much to both Danny and Helen for sparing all of the time in the build up to this and the time that you've got today. It was a really worthwhile discussion, and hopefully it's helped people who might be struggling. If you do enjoy these sessions, we have another one that's coming on October the 24th, where we've got Miles Courtney Thomas joining, and Katie Stabler joining, where we're talking about how you can create customer-centric strategies for contact centers. So please join us for that one on the 24th of October. And lastly, again, thank you very much to Danny. Thank you very much to Helen. And thank you very much to everybody who's tuned in. Take care. And I'll see you all next
Gary.
month.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.
Take care, everybody. I'll speak to you all soon. And I'll end the stream here.